Chapter 1. Historical and Biblical Background. Solomon's Wealth in the Ancient Texts. According to the biblical narrative, Solomon ruled a united Israelite kingdom, wealthy, powerful, and diplomatic. His wealth was legendary: gold, ivory, exotic animals, fine materials, and grand architectural projects. The Book of Kings and other biblical sources describe a king who received massive tributes, built a temple with gold and bronze works, and amassed vast stores of treasure. However, what the texts do not do is locate any mines. There is no explicit mention of Solomon's mines, no coordinate, no map, no detailed description of a hidden cavern of gold. The references are to trade, tribute, gifts, and material wealth accumulated over time. Also, some of the supposed source regions of metals or goods are vague or symbolic. Names like Ophir appear, but scholars remain uncertain where or what Ophir really referred to. Depending on interpretation, Ophir might have been a trade partner, a region, or even a metaphor for wealth. Thus, from purely textual sources, there is no confirmed blueprint or archaeological map of the mines of Solomon. The wealth may have come from trade, tribute, craftsmanship, not necessarily subterranean treasure vaults.
Chapter 2. Early Archaeology. Looking for Mines. The Rise of the Solomon's Mines Hypothesis. The idea that mines associated with Solomon might be physically found gained scholarly attention in the 20th century. A major early proponent was archaeologist Nelson Gluck, who in the 1930s proposed that the copper smelting sites in what is now Israel and Jordan, particularly a region called Timna Valley, could be remnants of Solomon's mines. The reasoning was partly geological, copper-rich deposits, partly biblical, accounts of Solomon sending fleets to the Red Sea port of Ezion-Geber, near modern Eilat or Aqaba, and partly based on visible evidence: slag from smelting furnaces, old mining shafts, and mineral deposits. Timna Valley became a hotspot for treasure hunters and researchers alike. Its reddish copper ore and ancient mines seemed, at first glance, a plausible match for the stories. Early excavations and skepticism. But early excavations, especially those led by archaeologist Benno Rothenberg, complicated the picture. Rothenberg's work, mainly in the 1960s to 1990s, uncovered an Egyptian temple dedicated to the goddess Hathor at one of the Timna sites. Hieroglyphs and religious artifacts dated the temple to the New Kingdom of Egypt, centuries before Solomon's reign. This cast serious doubt on the idea that the mines were Solomonic. In short, yes, there were mines and mining activity. Yes, there was copper smelting, slag, mineral exploitation, but they appeared to belong to an earlier civilization, likely Egyptian or other ancient peoples, not to the 10th century BCE Israelite kingdom. By the late 20th century, many scholars considered the case against actual Solomon's mines to be strong, that the biblical wealth stories were embellished or symbolic, and not necessarily linked to physical treasure vaults.
Chapter 3. Recent Discoveries. Renewed Debate. Copper, not gold. The 2013 to 2017 Timna excavations. Interest revived in the 2010s when archaeologists from Tel Aviv University, led by Erez Ben Yosef, re-examined the mines of Timna using more advanced techniques: radiocarbon dating, better stratigraphy, and organic remains analysis. Their findings shook up the previous consensus. They discovered that many of the copper smelting furnaces and mining camps at a site known as Slaves Hill were indeed active around the 10th century BCE, the approximate era of Solomon and his father King David, according to biblical chronology. Organic remains, including animal dung from donkeys used to carry ore, textiles, food remains, pottery, smelting slag, were radiocarbon dated to this period. Moreover, the site showed signs of a well-organized settlement, livestock pens, a fortified gatehouse, evidence of long-distance trade and supply lines. This re-established, at least in part, the possibility that large-scale metal production in the region was contemporary with Solomon's time. In other words, there was mining activity during the right era. What it means and what it doesn't. It does not prove these were Solomon's mines. The archaeological evidence does not tie the mines to him by name. There's no inscription, no direct reference linking the mine to him personally or to the biblical kingdom. As one scholar wrote, there remains biblical silence on any explicit mines. The operations at Timnah and similar sites were likely run by the Edomites, a tribal confederation mentioned in biblical sources as often hostile to Israel. The mined metal was copper, not gold, silver, or precious stones. Copper was a valuable resource in the ancient world, used in tools, ornaments, weaponry, and trade goods, but it is not the treasure trove imagined in popular folklore. So, the recent findings shift the debate. Perhaps there was a mining empire in the south, but it was copper-based and operated by a society other than Solomon's Israel.
Chapter 4. Interpretations and Scholarly Debate. Two schools, minimalists versus maximalists. In biblical archaeology and history, there are broadly two interpretive traditions when it comes to figures like David and Solomon. Maximalists tend to take the biblical narratives as generally reliable, arguing that archaeological evidence, when correctly interpreted, supports a strong monarchy, grand building projects, and possibly large-scale resource extraction. Minimalists argue that many of the stories were later constructions or exaggerations. They stress the lack of primary, contemporary inscriptions or records. In their view, figures like Solomon may represent legendary or composite rulers rather than concrete historical kings. The debate over Solomon's mines reflects these tensions. Does the presence of copper mines and smelting camps prove Solomon's wealth was real? Or does the lack of gold, the absence of inscriptions, and the alternative identity of the mine operators demonstrate that the stories were allegorical, exaggerated, or misattributed? The "mines did exist, but not as we imagined" hypothesis. Some researchers, struck by the new Timnah findings, propose a compromise. Yes, there were mines and smelting operations in the region during Solomon's era, but they were likely copper mines, not gold mines or gem-laden caverns. They may have been run by the Edomites or other groups, rather than by Solomon or Israel. Or perhaps Solomon had indirect control over the trade, but not direct ownership of the mines. This view preserves a grain of historical plausibility, avoids sensational claims, and aligns with what archaeology can, so far, support.
Chapter 5. Why the Legend Grew, From Myth to Adventure. Literary and Colonial Imagination. The myth of Solomon's mines as a spectacular lost treasure found new life in the 19th century at the height of European colonial expansion into Africa. Writers like H.R. Haggard tapped into contemporary fascination with unexplored lands, African riches, and treasure hunts. Their novels fused biblical legend, exotic settings, and adventure tropes to create a potent mythology. For many European readers, stories about treasure troves hidden in dark African caves offered both fantasy and justification for colonial ambition, a narrative of discovery, civilization, and salvation of lost riches. Later treasure hunters and adventurers took these as motivation to scour remote regions for treasure that likely never existed. Oral traditions and misidentification.
In some parts of southern Africa, or more broadly among trade networks reaching Africa, Arabia, India, and beyond, legends grew of distant mines, wealth, and exotic riches, often conflating biblical names, local oral traditions, and the memory of ancient kingdoms. As centuries passed, these stories became more elaborate: jewels, gold, hidden vaults, ancient curses, classic lost world material. This mixture of memory, myth, and imagination helped fuel the legend's endurance. The power of symbolism. Finally, citations of Solomon's wealth in religious texts functioned symbolically: a wise, just king endowed with divine favor. Whether or not he mined gold, the story conveyed power, prosperity, and moral legitimacy. Over time, that symbolism may have been literalized, transformed into physical treasure hunts and real mines. Chapter 6. What we know for sure. There are ancient mining and smelting sites, including in Timna Valley, that date to the 10th century BCE, roughly the biblical period of Solomon. These sites show evidence of organized metal production: furnaces, slag waste, animal pens, supplies, pottery, textiles, and fortifications, suggesting a complex society capable of sustained mining operations. The metal processed appears to have been largely copper, not gold, silver, or gemstones. There is no archaeological evidence directly linking these mines to King Solomon by name. No inscriptions, no royal seal, no document stating property of Solomon. The biblical records don't map mines, only general wealth and tribute. Were these mines operated by Solomon, the Israelites, the Edomites, or some other polity? Was there ever a mine of gold or precious gems, or was the wealth from metals like copper combined with trade and diplomacy? Did the wealth described in ancient texts stem from mines at all, or from taxes, tribute, trade routes, craftsmanship, and foreign commerce? Did subsequent storytellers exaggerate the ancient wealth into mythic treasure? Because of these unknowns, many historians and archaeologists remain skeptical of claims that Solomon's mines, as popularly imagined, ever existed. In fact, one 20-year study referenced by some researchers concluded that the legendary mines are a complete myth.
Chapter 7. Broader implications. Why it matters. Understanding the myth versus reality of Solomon's mines is more than a treasure hunter's curiosity. It touches on deeper issues: how we interpret ancient texts, literal versus symbolic readings, the difference between wealth as tribute or trade versus subterranean treasure, the reliability of archaeological dating. Early explorers lacked modern carbon dating. New methods can reshape old assumptions, as in the 2010s Timna rediscovery. Cultural memory versus historical fact. Oral traditions, myths, colonial literature, all influence how history is remembered and imagined. The danger of wishful thinking in history. When legend blurs with fact, we risk distorting past realities and imposing modern desires on ancient contexts.
Chapter 8. Conclusion. Myth, gold, or deception? So where does that leave King Solomon's mines? Myth? Fact? Somewhere in between. Fact. There were real mines, especially copper, in areas like Timna Valley, active around the 10th century BCE. The people who ran them had significant mining and metalworking capacity. Unproven. There is no verified evidence that those mines ever produced gold in the bounty and volume described in legend, nor that they belonged to Solomon personally. Likely myth. The notion of vast, hidden treasure caverns overflowing with gold, jewels, and biblical-style wealth appears to be a product of centuries of legend, projection, and romantic imagination, not historical or archaeological reality. In short, the human hunger for lost treasure, the allure of a golden past, and the romance of exploration have turned dusty mines and copper slag into shimmering legends. The real treasure may have been trade networks, metal production, and human ingenuity. Far less glamorous, but historically plausible. So when you ask the truth behind King Solomon's mines, myth, gold, or deception, the most honest answer is probably a mix. A kernel of truth lying under layers of myth, real mines and real metal, but no golden caverns filled with untold fortune. Instead, copper, trade, labor, and a story stretched across millennia.